Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us, and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city? Share your stories with us. Maybe the next betrayal story will be from your city, and we start. Daniel stood in the corner of the ballroom, clutching a glass of unfinished whiskey. His eyes, usually calm, with a slight shadow of fatigue from long working days, now glowed with something new, a mixture of anxiety and something sharper, which he could not yet name. The hall was buzzing with a corporate party. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, the muffled music of a jazz quartet, trying in vain to break through the roar of voices. But for Daniel, it all merged into monotonous noise, because his gaze was riveted on her. To Emily. She stood at the bar in a backless black dress that hugged her figure as if it had been tailored right for her. The dress was new. Daniel had never seen it before, and for some reason it offended him. Emily laughed, throwing her head back, her blonde hair flowing in waves, and her eyes sparkling under the light of the crystal chandeliers. She looked alive, real, almost alien, and next to her was Mark, her boss. Tall, with a confident smile and the type of charisma that makes people gravitate towards him even when they don't want to. Daniel noticed how Emily touched Mark's arm, a light, almost weightless movement, but it lasted a split second longer than necessary. Mark leaned closer, whispered something in her ear, and she laughed again, covering her mouth with her hand, as if he had said something forbidden. Daniel felt the whiskey burn his throat, even though he didn't take a sip. He stood there petrified, watching his wife, his Emily, disappear into the moment, completely ignoring his existence. He and Emily were married for 7 years. 7 years that began with falling madly in love, with conversations at night until dawn, with promises that they would always be honest with each other. But somewhere along the way, between his endless deadlines at the law firm and her meteoric rise at the marketing agency, something changed. They still loved each other, or at least he thought so. But their conversations became shorter, their touches became less frequent, and the evenings they spent together increasingly ended in silence, interrupted only by the sound of the TV. This party was the first time in a long time that Daniel agreed to go with her to a corporate event. Emily insisted, saying it was important for her career, that she needed to be there and he needed to support her. "You know how it works, Dan," she said, adjusting her earrings in the mirror. "It's not just a party, it's a game, and I have to play by the rules." Then her words seemed reasonable to him. Now, looking at her with Mark, he felt as if the rules of the game had changed, and they forgot to tell him. Daniel took a step forward, but stopped. What was he going to do? Walk up and interrupt them? Say something witty to remind Emily that he's here? Or should I just stand there like an idiot, clutching my glass so tightly that my fingers turned white? He hated himself for this indecisiveness. It was hot in the hall. The air was saturated with the smell of expensive perfume and alcohol, and he suddenly wanted to leave, just turn around and disappear. But he stayed, because I wanted to see. I wanted to know. Mark put his hand on Emily's waist, casually, as if it was natural. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He waited for Emily to pull away, take a step back, and remind Mark of his boundaries. But she didn't do anything. She continued to smile, her eyes sparkling, and Mark's hand remained where it was. It only lasted a few seconds, but for Daniel, each of them lasted an eternity. He turned away, trying to pull himself together. Maybe he's exaggerating everything. Maybe it's just her job to be charming, keep the conversation going, make an impression. Emily had always been good at this. She knew how to make people feel special, needed. But then why did he feel as if he had been erased from her world? "Dan, are you okay?" A voice behind him made him flinch. It was Laura, Emily's colleague, with whom he had crossed paths a couple of times at similar events. She held a glass of champagne in her hand and looked at him with a slight smile, but there was something else in her eyes, sympathy, curiosity. "Yes, everything is fine," he answered, trying to keep his voice even. But Laura didn't leave. She tilted her head as if studying him. "You sure? You look like you want to strangle someone," she joked, but her tone was soft, almost cautious. Daniel forced himself to smile. I just, I don't like such gatherings. Too many people, too little air. Laura nodded, but her gaze slid to where Emily stood. Yeah, parties like this can be intense, she said, taking a sip of champagne. There was something unsaid in her words, and Daniel felt his heart beat faster. What do you mean? He asked, trying to make it sound casual. Laura shrugged, but her eyes met his, and for a second he thought she wanted to say more. It's just, sometimes at these events people forget who they are, or who they came with. She paused, then added, but I'm sure Emily knows what she's doing. It was a blow, not straight, but strong enough that Daniel felt the blood rush to his face. He wanted to ask what she knew, what she saw, but Laura had already turned away, smiling at someone in the crowd, and a moment later disappeared among the guests. Daniel looked back at Emily. Now she stood a little further from Mark, but still close, still in his orbit. He noticed how she glanced in his direction, short, almost casual. Their eyes met, and for a split second it seemed to him that she wanted to come up and say something. But then Mark touched her shoulder, and she turned to him, her smile returned, and Daniel was left alone in his corner, with a glass that had long since become warm in his hand. He remembered how a few months ago Emily started working late, how her phone began to vibrate more often at night, and she brushed it off, saying that it was work chats. How she started buying new clothes, wearing makeup a little brighter, smiling a little wider, but not at him. Then he chalked it up to her ambitions, her desire to prove to herself and others that she was worth something. But now, looking at her and Mark, he wasn't so sure. The party continued, but for Daniel, it was already over. He put the glass on the table and headed towards the exit without looking back. The cold night air hit his face, and he took a deep breath, trying to clear away the lump in his throat. He didn't know what to do next. Should I talk to Emily? Ask her directly what's going on? Or continue to pretend that everything is fine until the cracks in their marriage tear it apart? But he knew one thing for sure. Something had changed. And this something was more than just flirting at a party. It was the beginning of the end, or perhaps the beginning of something else he couldn't yet understand. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the plate of cold pasta he had cooked 2 hours ago. The pesto sauce, her favorite, was already covered in a thin film, and the glass of wine he poured for Emily stood untouched. The clock on the wall ticked, measuring the time she spent at work again. He did not call her, did not write. He simply waited, although each click of the second hand increased the tension in his chest. The house was too quiet. There was no usual sound of her steps on the parquet floor, light laughter when she talked about something insignificant, or the rustle of pages when she read before going to bed. Silence filled everything, and in this emptiness Daniel felt like a stranger in his own home. He stood up, put the plate in the refrigerator, and poured himself more wine, although the taste was no longer pleasant. This was the third evening in a week that Emily had not returned for dinner. 2 weeks had passed since that party, but the image of her laughing, with Mark's hand on her waist, was ingrained in Daniel's memory, like a stain that could not be wiped off. He tried to talk to her, but every conversation ended either in her irritation or in his own silence. "You think too much, Dan," she said one day when he asked why she was home so late. Her tone was light, almost mocking, but there was something flashing in her eyes that he couldn't decipher. Maybe it was guilt, or just tired. Emily has changed. Not immediately, not abruptly, but gradually, as if someone was slowly turning off the light in their relationship. She began to look into his eyes less often, her smiles were shorter, and her touches were almost random. She stopped asking how his day was, and instead filled the silence with stories about work, about new projects, about meetings, about Mark, who, in her words, understands how to move the company forward. Every time she mentioned his name, Daniel felt something clench inside. He tried to maintain normalcy. He cleaned the house, cooked dinner, even offered to go to the movies, like they used to do when everything was simpler. But Emily brushed it off, citing deadlines. "After this project, Dan, I promise," she said without looking up from her phone. He nodded, although he knew that after this project there would be another, and then another. Work became her refuge, and he became an unnecessary element in her new reality. Daniel wasn't one to give in to paranoia. He always prided himself on his rationality, his ability to analyze a situation, as in the courtroom, where he built arguments based on facts. But now the facts were forming an alarming picture. Emily no longer left her phone on the table like before. She carried him with her even into the bathroom, and although Daniel never thought he would be such a person, he one day found himself wanting to check her messages. He didn't do it not because he didn't want to, but because he was afraid of what he would find. One evening, when she was home after all, he noticed how she quickly closed the application when he entered the room. It was so fast, almost reflexively, that he didn't have time to say anything. She immediately started talking about something else, a new client, some presentation, but her voice was too high, too hasty. Daniel nodded, pretending to listen, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered Laura's words from the party. Sometimes people forget who they are. He had shrugged it off then, but now her voice sounded in his head like a warning. Saturday morning was the first time in a long time that Emily didn't go to work. Daniel woke up earlier and made coffee black for himself, with caramel syrup for her. He hoped this would be a chance to talk, to regain something they had lost. But when he entered the bedroom with two mugs, Emily was already sitting on the bed, buried in her laptop. "Good morning," he said, trying to keep his voice warm. She looked up and smiled, but the smile was forced, as if she had been caught by surprise. "Morning. Thanks for the coffee." She took the mug, but immediately returned to the screen. Daniel stood in the doorway, unsure whether to leave or stay. He took a sip, burning his tongue, and decided to try it. "Should we go somewhere today? Shall we take a walk and have lunch somewhere?" He tried to speak lightly, but he felt the tension in his voice betray him. Emily sighed, not looking up from her laptop. "Dan, I have a lot of work to do. Mark wants me to have a report ready by Monday, and I haven't even started yet." Mark again. Daniel felt his fingers tighten around the mug. "You're at work all the time. Maybe take a day off. One day won't change anything." She finally looked at him, and there was something akin to irritation in her gaze. "It's not that simple, Dan. You know how it works. If I don't do it now, I'll miss the chance. This is important." "What about us?" The words came out before he had time to think about them. "Are we important?" Emily froze. Her eyes narrowed, and for a second he thought she would say something harsh. But instead, she closed her laptop and stood up, placing her mug on the nightstand. "You're starting to sound like I need to justify myself. I'm working to make sure everything goes well for us, so that we can have this home, this life. Do you really want me to feel guilty for this?" Daniel opened his mouth, but couldn't find anything to say. Her words were logical, but there was no warmth in them. This was not a conversation, but a defense. He watched her go into the bathroom and heard the lock click. The coffee in his hand grew cold. The silence in the house became unbearable. She was not just the absence of sound, but something alive that filled the space between them. Daniel began to notice little things he hadn't seen before. How Emily stopped wearing her wedding ring, explaining that it was getting in the way at work. How she started putting on makeup even at home, which she had never done before. How her laughter, so lively at that party, now rarely sounded within their walls. He tried to distract himself. He worked overtime at the company, went to the gym, even started reading the book Emily gave him for his anniversary, but never finished reading. But all this was temporary. His thoughts went back to her, to Mark, to what he saw at the party, and to what he didn't know. One night, when Emily was late again, he couldn't stand it. He opened her laptop, which she had left in the kitchen, and entered the password, the same one she used for everything. The screen lit up, and he froze, looking at the folders, the emails, the calendar. His heart was pounding as if he were committing a crime. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to find something. Or not to be found. He clicked on the work folder, but immediately heard the sound of a key in the lock. Daniel slammed his laptop shut and leaned back in his chair, trying to breathe evenly. Emily walked in, her hair slightly disheveled and her cheeks slightly pink, as if she was in a hurry. She looked at him, then at the laptop, and her eyebrows raised slightly. "What are you doing?" she asked, and there was no accusation in her voice, but there was something else. Maybe fear. "Nothing," he answered too quickly. "Just waiting for you." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer than necessary. Then she went into the bedroom, and Daniel remained sitting, feeling the silence become even heavier. He didn't know how long he could live like this. Suspicions grew like weeds, filling everything that was left of their marriage. He wanted to trust her, he wanted to give back what they had, but every day brought a new crack. And in this silence, in this empty house, Daniel began to understand that the truth, whatever it was, would not give him peace. Daniel stood at the window in the living room, looking out at the empty street lit by lanterns. His phone lay on the windowsill, the screen glowing with a notification from Emily. "I'll be late, don't wait up." The message had arrived an hour ago, but he was still looking at it, as if the letters could form a different phrase, one that didn't make him feel like he was drowning. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened her calendar, synced with his phone from the days when they planned everything together. Today it was empty. No meetings, no deadlines. Just emptiness. 2 weeks after that conversation in the kitchen, when he almost looked at her laptop, Daniel began to notice details that he had previously avoided. Small, almost imperceptible, but they formed a picture that made him feel sick. Emily no longer left her phone unattended. Her voice became sharper when he asked about work. And yesterday he found in her bag a receipt from a cafe where they had never been together, with the date and time when she was supposedly at a meeting. He didn't tell her about this. He simply hid the check in his pocket and tossed and turned all night, imagining her at a table with someone else. In the morning, he decided to act. Not because I wanted to, but because I could no longer live in this limbo. He started small. He called Laura, Emily's colleague, under the pretext of organizing a surprise for their anniversary. Laura agreed to meet at a cafe near their office. When he arrived, she was already sitting at the table, stirring her coffee. "Dan, you look tired," she said as soon as he sat down. Her tone was friendly, but her eyes showed the same caution as at the party. "Work," he lied, shrugging. "Listen, I want to do something special for Emily. Maybe dinner or a trip. But she's busy all the time. Don't you know what's going on in her office? Maybe some big projects." Laura looked at him, and for a second he thought she could see right through him. She took a sip of coffee as if she was stalling for time. "Well, you know Emily. She's always in business. The last months are especially so. A new client, a lot of meetings. Mark puts a lot of pressure on her." Mark's name is cut like a knife. Daniel squeezed the cup a little tighter. "Yes, she talks about him often. He seems like a demanding boss." Laura chuckled, but her smile was forced. "You could say that. He likes to be in control. And Emily, she knows how to work with him. They get along well." "How good?" The words came out faster than he could think. Laura raised her eyebrows, and Daniel realized he had gone too far. He forced himself to smile. "You mean she doesn't work overtime because of him? I'm just worried." Laura looked away, looking somewhere to the side. "Dan, I'm not a spy to follow her. But," she hesitated, "sometimes she's late not because of work. Sometimes she and Mark go for coffee after meetings, or for dinner with clients. It's part of her job, you know." "Dinner with clients," he repeated, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "And how often does she have dinner like this?" Laura shrugged. "I don't know, Dan. I'm not keeping score. But if it bothers you, talk to her. Emily, she's not one to do things for nothing." He nodded, but her words only increased his anxiety. Laura knew more than she said, but she had no intention of betraying her friend. Daniel thanked her, paid for the coffee, and left, feeling a storm growing in his chest. At home, he began to dig deeper. Emily left for a meeting, and he had a few hours. He opened her laptop without hesitation this time. The password still worked, and for some reason that made him angry. She didn't think he'd get to that point. He flipped through her mail, but found nothing, only work letters, reports, campaign plans. Then he opened the messenger. Most of the chats were with colleagues, but one stood out, with Mark. Daniel clicked on it and his heart sank. The messages were short, but their tone was too warm. "Great job today, you were great," Mark wrote. "Thank you, I couldn't have done it without you," Emily answered. There were emoticons, damn emoticons, that she never used in correspondence with him. One message from last week made him freeze. "See you at 8? Don't be late." Emily replied, "I'll be there on time, boss." Nothing explicit, but enough for his imagination to imagine the worst. He closed the laptop, feeling the blood pounding in his temples. This is not proof, he told himself. It's just correspondence. But why then couldn't he breathe? That evening, Emily returned home earlier than usual. Daniel sat in the living room, pretending to read. She threw her bag on the sofa and smiled at him for the first time in a long time. Her smile seemed sincere. "Hi," she said, taking off her coat. "Are you busy? Maybe we can order something? I'm starving." He looked at her, trying to find traces of lies in her face. "Where have you been?" he asked, and his voice sounded colder than he intended. Emily froze, her smile faltering. "At work, Dan. As usual." "What kind of question?" "Just wondering," he shrugged, but his eyes never left her. "You are often late. I thought maybe it was something important." She sighed and sat down opposite him, crossing her arms. "Are you starting again?" "I already said, we have a new client. Mark wants everything to be perfect. This is not just a job, this is my chance." "Mark," he repeated, and the name sounded like an accusation. "You spend a lot of time with him." Emily rolled her eyes. "Seriously, Dan, he's my boss. Of course I spend time with him. It's called a career." "Career," he nodded, but his voice became quieter, more dangerous. "What about coffee after work? Dinners with clients? Is this also a career?" Her face changed. The eyes narrowed, the lips pressed into a thin line. "Were you following me?" "I'm not watching," he stood up, feeling anger overwhelm him. "But I'm not blind, Emily. I see how you have changed. You're barely at home, you don't talk to me, you." He paused, not daring to say it out loud. "What's happening? Just tell me the truth." Emily looked at him, and her gaze was mixed with anger and something else, maybe fear. "Really?" She stood up, her voice trembling. "The truth is that I work like hell so that we can live the way we do. And instead of supporting me, you create scenes and look for a catch where there is none. Do you really think that I'm cheating on you?" The word hung in the air like a blow. Daniel felt his resolve crumble. He wanted to say yes, he wanted to lay out everything, the messages, the check, her smile at that party. But instead he remained silent because he had no direct evidence. Only footprints in the sand that were washed away by each of her phrases. "I don't know what to think," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. Emily shook her head, her eyes sparkling. "Then maybe you should decide whether you trust me or not, because I can't live with a man who sees me as an enemy." She went into the bedroom, slamming the door. Daniel was left alone, looking at her bag abandoned on the couch. He knew he had to stop, but instead he began to think about where to look next. Daniel watched Emily pack her suitcase. Her movements were fast, confident, almost mechanical, folding her blouse, zipping her cosmetic bag, checking tickets on her phone. She was saying something about the conference in Chicago, about marketing strategies, new clients, how important it was for her career. But Daniel barely listened. His gaze was drawn to her hands, to the way she avoided looking into his eyes. "I'll be back Sunday night," she said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Don't be too bored, okay?" She smiled, but the smile was superficial, as if painted on. "Good luck," he replied, and his voice sounded even, although everything was boiling inside. He didn't ask who else was coming. Didn't mention Mark. After their last conversation, when she accused him of not trusting him, he decided that words would no longer help. He needed facts. As the front door closed, Daniel pulled out his phone and opened the flight tracking app. Emily said her plane was leaving in 2 hours. He checked. There really was a flight to Chicago. But something in her behavior, too fast phrases, too frequent glances at her watch made him doubt. He opened her calendar, synchronized with his. No conference. Just a note. Chicago, 2 days. That was all. Daniel had no plans to follow her. The idea seemed wild and humiliating to him. He is a lawyer, a man who builds his life on logic and evidence, and should not stoop to spying on his own wife. But after months of suspicion, after her evasive answers and cold distance, he couldn't just sit and wait. He should have known. That same evening, he bought a ticket for an early morning flight to Chicago. I told myself that this was not surveillance, but a check. If she really is at the conference, he will leave and no one will know. If not, he didn't allow himself to think about what would happen if not. Chicago greeted him with gray skies and a cold wind from the lake. Daniel rented a car and drove to the hotel where Emily said the conference was being held. A huge building made of glass and steel with a sign reading, Marketing Summit 2025. He entered the hall, feeling like a stranger among the business suits and badges. I went up to the reception desk and asked if the conference was taking place here. The girl behind the counter nodded, but when he said Emily's name, she shook her head. "There's no one with that name on the list," she said, flipping through her tablet. Daniel felt the floor disappear from under his feet. He thanked him and walked out, clutching the car keys so tightly that the metal dug into his palm. He got into the car and sat there for half an hour, trying to figure out what to do next. Maybe she's in another hotel. Maybe this is a mistake. But deep down, he knew that there were no mistakes. He started with her favorite places. Emily always said Chicago was her city. She loved the waterfront, the little coffee shops in the Loop, the bustling bars in River North. Daniel drove around to several places they had been together, but she was nowhere to be found. Late in the evening, he stopped at the Violet Hour, a place she had once mentioned to a friend. This was her style: dark interior, cocktails with clever names, an atmosphere where you can disappear. He entered, trying not to attract attention, and took a table in the corner. The bar was full. Laughter, clinking glasses, muffled music. Daniel ordered whiskey, although he had no intention of drinking. He simply waited, scanning the crowd, and 20 minutes later he saw her. Emily was sitting at the far end of the room, at a table by the window. Her hair was down, and she was wearing a blue dress that he didn't recognize. Mark sat opposite her. They didn't look like colleagues at a business meeting. Their heads were tilted towards each other. Her hand lay on the table, almost touching it. She laughed, and this laughter, lively, sincere, was something that Daniel had not heard from her for months. He froze, afraid to even breathe. He wanted to get up, come over, say something, but his body refused to move. And then Mark leaned closer, and Emily didn't move away. Their lips met a short but confident kiss, as if this was not the first time. Daniel felt the world around him shrink to a single point. He could not look away, although every second was tearing him apart from the inside. They pulled away, and Emily smiled, fixing her hair. Mark said something, and she laughed again, touching his arm. It wasn't just cheating. It was another life in which Daniel did not exist. He didn't remember leaving the bar. I didn't remember how I got into the car or how I got to the airport. All he saw was her smile directed at someone else. All he felt was an emptiness that filled him to the brim. He bought a ticket for the next flight home and looked out the window all the way where the clouds hid the stars. When he entered their house, it was already past midnight. Silence greeted him like an old enemy. He threw the keys on the table, walked into the living room, and sat on the sofa without turning on the light. Emily's suitcase was still by the door, the one she supposedly took in Chicago. He looked at him, and only one question was spinning in his head: how to live further. Daniel didn't know what he would say to her when she returned. I didn't know if he could speak at all. But he knew one thing for sure. The truth he was looking for was worse than he could have imagined. And now, sitting in the dark, he felt how their marriage, their life, everything they had built for 7 years was crumbling like sand in the wind. Daniel sat in the darkness of the living room, lit only by the faint light of a street lamp shining through the curtains. His hands were on his knees, his fingers clutching a small object, the business card of the Violet Hour bar, which he had automatically taken from the counter as he left Chicago. On the back he wrote one word, Saw. Black pen, sharp letters, as if carved with a knife. The card lay on the coffee table in front of him, next to their wedding rings, his and hers. He had taken his off his finger an hour ago, after much thought, and taken her ring from the box in the bedroom, where it had been lying since she stopped wearing it, citing inconvenience. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe to let her know the game is over. Maybe to put an end to it myself. But the words he had rehearsed in his head, all the way from Chicago, accusations, questions, screams, now seemed useless. What can you say to a person who has already chosen a different life? Instead, he chose silence, and this little piece of cardboard that spoke for him. Emily returned on Sunday evening as promised. Daniel heard the key turn in the lock and her heels click on the parquet floor. She walked into the living room, leaving her suitcase at the door, and turned on the light. Her eyes, tired but still bright, settled on him. She looked as if nothing had changed. The same confident smile, the same slight tilt of her head that he had once found charming. "Hi," she said, taking off her coat. "You weren't sleeping. It's already late." Daniel didn't answer. He looked at her, and in his gaze there was neither anger nor pain, only emptiness, which frightened even himself. Emily frowned, her smile faltering. "Dan, did something happen?" She took a step forward, but stopped when she noticed a card on the table. Her gaze slid over the rings, then over the inscription. She froze, and at that moment her face changed. The confidence disappeared, replaced by something Daniel had never seen in her. Fear. "What is this?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were glued to the card, as if she could make it disappear. Daniel was silent. He waited for her to say something else, to make excuses, to lie, to scream. But Emily just stood there. Her breathing became heavier, her fingers clenched into fists. She knew he was there. She knew that he saw her with Mark, saw their kiss, saw her laugh, which no longer belonged to him. "Dan," she finally said, looking up, "it's not what you think." He chuckled, but there was no amusement in the sound. "Isn't that right? What is this, Emily? Enlighten me." She opened her mouth, but the words stuck. Her lips trembled, and for a second he thought she was going to cry. But instead she straightened up, as if about to defend herself. "Were you following me?" Her voice became sharper. "Did you really go to Chicago to, what? Catch me? Is this how you trust me?" Daniel shook his head, his hands still on his knees, still as stone. "I trusted you. 7 years. I trusted you even when you stopped coming home, stopped talking to me, stopped being my wife. But you made your choice, Emily, and I saw him." Her face turned pale. She took a step back, as if his words had struck her. "You don't understand," she began, but her voice broke. It, it was a mistake. It doesn't mean anything." "Does it mean anything?" He stood up, and his voice finally wavered. "You kissed him. You laughed with him like you hadn't laughed with me in months. You lied to me, Emily. Every day, every night, when you said that this was a job, that this was a career. And you dare stand here and say it doesn't mean anything." Emily was silent. Her eyes sparkled, but no tears flowed. She looked at him, and in her gaze there was something similar to a plea, but she did not say a word. Maybe because she knew that no words could correct what he saw. Daniel walked over to the table, took the card, and placed it in front of her. "I don't want to hear your excuses," he said quietly. "I don't want to hear you try to make it my fault. I just want you to know that I know, and I can't pretend that everything is fine anymore." He turned and walked towards the door, but her voice stopped him. "Dan, wait." She stepped towards him. Her hand reached out, but froze in the air. "Please, let's talk. I didn't want this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt you." He stopped, but didn't turn around. "You didn't mean to," he repeated, and there was bitterness in his voice. "But you did it, and now we are here." Emily was silent. He heard her breathing, her steps stopping behind him. He waited, not because he wanted to hear anything else, but because part of him still hoped that she would say something that would take them back to the time when they were happy. But she was silent. Daniel opened the bedroom door and closed it behind him. He didn't lock it, there was no need. Emily didn't follow him. He lay down on the bed without undressing and looked at the ceiling until the darkness began to blur before his eyes. He didn't cry, didn't shout. He just lay there, feeling the last threads connecting them break one after another. In the morning, he woke up to the sound of footsteps. Emily was packing her things in the living room. He walked out, and their eyes met. She looked exhausted, there were shadows under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back into a messy bun. The rings were still on the table, but the card had disappeared. "I'll be gone for a couple of days," she said without looking at him. "I need to think." Daniel nodded. He didn't ask where she was going. Didn't ask if she would come back. He just watched her take her bag and leave, and when the door closed, the house fell silent again. But now this silence was different, not heavy, not oppressive, but empty, as if everything that made up their life had gone with it. He walked over to the table and took his ring. He twirled it in his fingers, feeling the coldness of the metal. Then he put it back and went to the kitchen to make coffee. Life went on, even if he didn't yet know how to live on. Daniel sat in his law firm's office, staring at a blank laptop screen. It was drizzling outside the window, gray drops flowed down the glass, blurring the outlines of the city. It's been 3 days since Emily left, saying she needed to think. She didn't call, didn't write, and he didn't try to find her. The silence between them, which had previously been painful, now seemed inevitable, like the last chord of a song that no one wanted to finish. He took out a folder with documents from his desk drawer. Inside were the divorce forms he had printed out last night. He didn't fill them in, but their very presence, black letters on white paper, made everything seem real. He ran his finger along the edge of the folder, feeling the heaviness in his chest becoming almost tangible. Divorce, a word he never thought to apply to his life. There was a knock on the door. Daniel looked up and saw Emily. She stood in the doorway, her raincoat wet from the rain, her hair sticking to her temples. Her face was pale, without makeup, and at that moment she looked not the confident woman from the party, but someone else vulnerable, almost broken. "Can I come in?" Her voice was quiet, almost timid. Daniel nodded, closing the folder. He didn't get up or invite her to sit down, but she went in anyway and closed the door behind her. She stopped at the table, her hands nervously fiddling with the strap of her bag. "I know you don't want to see me," she began, looking at the floor, "and I don't blame you, but I have to say, everything." Daniel was silent. He looked at her, and in his gaze there was neither anger nor hope, only fatigue. Emily took a deep breath and continued. "I didn't want it to turn out like this, Dan." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. I'm confused. Work, pressure, these endless deadlines. I felt like I was losing myself. And Mark, he was there. He listened. He made me feel like I was still worth something. It was wrong, I know, but I didn't plan anything like that. Daniel felt his fingers curl into fists. "You kissed him, Emily," he said, and his voice was cold as the rain outside the window. "You've been lying to me for months. It's not just confused, it's a choice." She winced, but nodded. "Yes, it was a choice, and I hate myself for it. But Dan, I don't want to lose us. I don't want to lose you. What happened with Mark, it was a mistake. It's over. I swear it won't happen again." Her words sounded sincere, and some part of Daniel, the part that still remembered their early years, their laughter, their nights spent talking, wanted to believe. But the other part, the part that saw her with Mark, that held the card that said "seen," knew that Faith died somewhere in a bar in Chicago. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and his voice became quieter, almost cracking. "If you were so unhappy, if the routine was killing you, why didn't you come to me? We could make things right. Together." Emily shook her head, her eyes sparkling. "I don't know. I was afraid. I was afraid that you wouldn't understand, that you'd think I was weak. You've always been so. Collected, Dan. You always knew what you wanted. And I was just trying to keep up. He looked at her, and there was truth in her words, a truth that he did not want to see before. Their marriage did not collapse overnight. It was destroyed slowly in the silence of their home, in her late returns, in his silent consent to the fact that she was moving away. But that didn't justify her, didn't justify the lie. I want to try again, she said, taking a step closer. I know I don't deserve this, but I love you, Dan. I've always loved you. We can start again. We can be better. Daniel closed his eyes. Her words were like an echo of the past, the promises they made to each other 7 years ago, standing in front of the altar. But now they sounded empty. He remembered her laugh with Mark, her hand on his shoulder, her lies that lasted for months. He remembered how he waited for her with the cold dinner, how he looked for her in Chicago, how he looked at their rings on the table. And he realized that he could not go back. I can't, Emily, he said, opening his eyes. I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't look at you and not see him. Trust. It doesn't come back, no matter how hard you try. Her face contorted as if he had hit her. Dan, please, she stepped toward him, her voice breaking. I'll do whatever you want. Therapy, moving, whatever. Just give me a chance. He shook his head, his hand resting on the folder with documents. I gave you a chance. 7 years. But you didn't choose me. Emily was silent. The tears she had been holding back finally rolled down her cheeks. She didn't try to wipe them away, she just stood there looking at him, as if she hoped he would change his mind. But Daniel had already made up his mind. He took the forms out of the folder and placed them on the table. I'm filing for divorce, he said, and his voice was calm, almost lifeless. This is not a punishment, it's just. The end. We both need to move on. Emily looked at the papers, her lips trembling. Do you really want this? She whispered. I want us to stop lying to each other, he replied, and for myself. She nodded, slowly, as if every movement hurt her. Then she turned and walked towards the door. She stopped at the threshold, but did not turn around. I'm sorry, Dan, she said quietly. Is it true? He didn't answer. The door closed, and the office fell into silence again. Daniel took a pen and began filling out the forms. His hand didn't shake, but every stroke felt like a goodbye not just to Emily, but to the part of himself that still believed in them. When he finished, the rain outside the window stopped. The city behind the glass looked cleaner, but colder. Daniel put the documents into a folder and put it in a drawer. Tomorrow he will take them to court. Tomorrow a new life will begin. But today he just sat there, staring at a blank screen, trying to figure out how to learn to live without her. The new place smelled of fresh paint and other people's memories, a smell that was not his. The windows looked out onto a narrow street where cars hummed and passers-by hurried about their business. This was not his and Emily's house, with its cozy veranda and creaky parquet floors, but something temporary, functional. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a living room where the sofa could barely fit. He chose this apartment for its simplicity. It did not require anything from him except payment of rent. But now, standing in silence, he felt loneliness enveloping him like a cold fog. He threw the keys on the kitchen table, their jingle echoing off the bare walls. The boxes were labeled in his neat handwriting: books, clothes, kitchen. But one, without an inscription, stood in the corner, and he avoided opening it. There were things he'd taken from their house without a second thought. A frame with a photo of their wedding, her favorite mug, a ticket to a concert they'd gone to in their first year of marriage. He didn't know why he took it. Maybe to remind myself that everything was real. Maybe to punish myself. The move began a week ago, after she and Emily signed the first documents on the division of property. The legal process was cold and methodical, like surgery without anesthesia. Their lawyers, his colleague from the firm, and the woman Emily had hired sat around the conference room table, breaking down their lives into bullet points: house, car, savings, even furniture. Daniel looked at the lists, and it seemed to him that they were dividing not things, but years, memories, promises. Emily sat opposite her, her face inscrutable, but her fingers nervously fiddling with her pen. She didn't look at him, and he was grateful for that. Her gaze, the one that had once been his home, now cut like a shard of glass. "Mrs. Wilson keeps the house," her lawyer said, adjusting her glasses. "Mr. Wilson agrees to compensation in the amount of half the cost." Daniel nodded, although something sank inside him. He didn't want a house. I didn't want to return to a place where every corner would remind me of her. But the thought that she would live there, perhaps with someone else, burned him from the inside. He signed the papers without saying a word and left the office, feeling the air get heavier. That evening, he stayed in his new apartment for the first time. I only unpacked the mattress and coffee maker. He made coffee, but didn't drink it. The taste was as bitter as his thoughts. He lay down on the mattress, looking at the ceiling, and tried to remember who he was without Emily. Lawyer, a man in his 40s who is starting over, or just a shadow of a man who once believed in love. There was no answer, only silence, which became his constant companion. The morning in the new apartment began the same way. Alarm clock at 6:30, a cold shower to chase away the rest of the restless sleep, and a cup of black coffee, which he drank while standing by the window. He used to make breakfast for two, an omelet for himself, avocado toast for Emily. Now he rarely eats in the morning. Zivitchka, like many others, lost the meaning of cooking for her. He stopped buying her favorite caramel syrup, stopped leaving the light on in the hallway, stopped checking her calendar. But those voids, the places where she once was, were not filled by anything else. They simply gaped like holes in his life. During the day, he immersed himself in work. Business in the company was his salvation. Contracts, negotiations, disputes. He took on more clients than he could handle, just to avoid returning to the apartment before midnight. But even work did not drown out the internal conflict that tore him apart. Anger at Emily, at Mark, at myself for not noticing how everything was falling apart struggled with the pain that came in the quietest moments. He hated her for her lies, for her betrayal, but every time he signed new divorce papers, he felt like he was losing a part of himself. She was his wife, his best friend, his home. And now that she was gone, he didn't know how to put himself back together. The second meeting on the division of property was more difficult. They met in her lawyer's office, in a room with panoramic windows that made everything too open, too vulnerable. Emily walked in first, and Daniel noticed that she had lost weight. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her eyes, usually bright, seemed dull. She sat opposite him, her hands on the table, and their eyes met for the first time in weeks. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson," her lawyer began, but Emily interrupted her. "Can we have a minute?" Her voice was quiet but firm. The lawyers looked at each other, but left, leaving them alone. Daniel looked at her, not knowing what to expect. She was silent for several seconds, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the notebook. "I didn't want it to end like this," she finally said, looking into his eyes. "I know you hate me, and I deserve it, but I still see us, of who we were, and it hurts, Dan." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. He felt anger rise in his chest, but it was immediately followed by pain, old, familiar, like a scar. "Do you see us?" His voice was low, almost threatening. "And I see you with him. I see how you lied to me, how you chose him. Don't talk to me about pain, Emily. You don't know what it is." She flinched, but didn't look away. "I know," she whispered. "I know what I did, and I live with this every day. But I don't want us to become enemies. We were more than that." Daniel shook his head, his hands clenched into fists under the table. "We were, but you destroyed it. And now I'm trying to figure out how to live without you, without everything we've built. And you ask me not to be an enemy? I'm not your enemy, Emily. I'm just nobody." Her eyes sparkled, but she held back her tears. "You are not a nobody," she said quietly. "You were always better than I deserved." He didn't answer. The door opened, the lawyers returned, and the meeting continued. They divided the rest. She took the car, he took part of the savings. But each point felt like another nail in the lid of their marriage. When it was over, Emily paused at the door as if she wanted to say something else, but Daniel left first, not giving her a chance. Evenings in the apartment were the hardest. He turned on the TV to drown out the silence, but didn't watch. I tried to read, but the words blurred. One day, he took out a guitar that he hadn't touched in years and tried to play a tune that he and Emily loved. But the fingers did not obey, and the sound was alien. He put the guitar away and never touched it again. His friends, those who remained after the divorce, tried to get him out of this state. A colleague at the company, Tom, invited him for a beer, but Daniel refused. His sister, who lived in another state, called every week, but he couldn't talk about how he felt. "You're strong, Dan," she once said. "You can handle it." He nodded into the phone, but didn't believe it. The power he had was gone with Emily, leaving only an empty shell. He started running in the morning, not because he loved sports, but because the physical pain was simpler than the one that lived inside. The cold air burned his lungs, his heart was pounding, and for that half hour he could forget about her. After a run, he stood under the shower, closing his eyes, and imagined that he was washing away not only sweat, but also everything that connected him with the past. It didn't work, but he continued. The legal process dragged on. Divorce in their state took time, especially when it came to dividing property. The third meeting was scheduled for a month later, and Daniel knew that he would see Emily again. He prepared for this as if it were a fight, repeating to himself that he would not let her break through his defenses. But at night, when sleep did not come, he thought about her words. "You were always better than I deserved." And anger mixed with melancholy, forcing him to toss and turn until dawn. He began to look for himself, not the Daniel who was Emily's husband, but the one he was before her. I took a photography class because I loved taking pictures in college. I bought a second-hand camera and started walking around the city, capturing street scenes, an old man feeding pigeons, a child running after a kite, a sunset over a river. It didn't fill the void, but it gave him something of his own, something that wasn't related to her. One day, he came across a box without an inscription. I opened it, despite my internal protest, and found their wedding photo. They stood on the beach, she laughed, her dress fluttering in the wind, and he looked at her as if the whole world was in her smile. Daniel held the photo for a long time, feeling the anger and pain merge into one. He wanted to tear the photo up, but instead put it back. Not because he forgave her, but because it was part of his story, part of who he was. The last divorce meeting was the shortest. They signed the final documents, and their marriage officially ended. Emily looked calmer than before, but her eyes were red, as if she had cried before. When the lawyers left, she turned to him. "I hope you find happiness, Dan," she said quietly. "You deserve it." He looked at her, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel angry, only fatigue and strange relief. "Goodbye, Emily," he said, and these were the last words. He returned to the apartment and opened the window, letting in the cold air. I took out my camera and started looking at the pictures I had taken the day before. One of them, the silhouette of a bird against the sunset, seemed successful to him. He smiled for the first time in a long time and realized that maybe one day he would learn to live again. Not for her, not for them, but for myself. Daniel didn't sleep all night. He lay on the couch in his new apartment, looking up at the ceiling, where the shadows from the streetlights created patterns like cracks. Thoughts about the last meeting with Emily, about the signed documents, about her words, "You deserve happiness," were spinning in my head like a broken record. He tried to distract himself by turning on an old movie, but the sound of the TV only intensified the emptiness. By 4 in the morning, he gave in, made coffee and drank it, standing by the window, until the sky began to turn gray. Fatigue pressed on my temples, but sleep did not come. Instead, there was only heaviness, not anger, not pain, but something worse. The feeling that he had lost not only Emily, but also himself. He decided to go to the office earlier, hoping that work would drown out the chaos in his head. The road was empty, the city was still sleeping. Daniel turned on the radio, but the music was annoying, so he turned it off, leaving only the sound of tires on wet asphalt. The rain that began at night left puddles on the road, and the headlights reflected in them like broken stars. He didn't notice how his eyes began to droop, how his hands on the steering wheel relaxed. At an intersection where the traffic light was flashing yellow, he saw a truck coming out on the right too late. The blow was deafening. The glass cracked, the metal scraped, and the world began to spin, as if in a kaleidoscope. The last thing he remembered was the taste of blood in his mouth and the distant sound of a siren. Daniel regained consciousness in the hospital. The white ceiling, the smell of antiseptic, the beeping of the monitor counting his pulse. My head hurt, as if it were being squeezed in a vice, and my left arm was in a cast. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ribs made him freeze. The room was quiet, only muffled voices and footsteps could be heard outside the door. "You've woken up," a woman's voice said. "Lie down, don't move. I'll call the doctor now." Daniel turned his head and saw the nurse. She was a little over 30, her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her eyes green, with tired kindness looked at him with a slight smile. The badge read, "Sarah." "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, as if his throat had been burned with sand. "City Hospital," she answered, adjusting the Roman 4. "Did you have an accident? Broken arm, a couple of cracked ribs, concussion. But you're in luck. It could have been worse." He nodded, although the words came to him with difficulty. Lucky, a strange word for a man whose life has fallen apart in recent months. Sarah left, and soon the doctor appeared, an elderly man with bushy eyebrows who spoke quickly and efficiently. "The fractures are not complex. The concussion is mild, a week in the hospital, then recovery." Daniel listened, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was not relieved that he had survived. He didn't feel anything at all. The first days in the hospital were a blur. Medicines dulled the pain in the body, but did not touch the one that sat deeper. Daniel lay looking out the window, where the rain gave way to the sun, and the sun turned to rain again. His colleague, Tom, stopped by on the second day, bringing coffee and awkward words of encouragement. "You're strong, Dan, you'll get better," he said, but Daniel only nodded, unable to find the strength to answer. My sister called, but he asked her not to come. He didn't want to be seen like this, broken not only on the outside, but also on the inside. At night, when the ward plunged into twilight, he did not sleep. His thoughts returned to the accident, to how he had lost control. He blamed himself for his inattention, for his fatigue, for allowing his life to come to this. And then thoughts inevitably returned to Emily. He imagined her living in their house, drinking coffee from that same mug, and possibly dating Mark. These images were like poison, slowly poisoning him. He hated her, but he hated himself even more for still missing her. Depression came over him quietly, almost imperceptibly. He stopped eating hospital food, leaving the trays untouched. I stopped answering doctors' questions, limiting myself to monosyllabic yes or no. Even the photo he took before the accident, a bird at sunset, no longer brought joy. He looked at her on his phone and saw only gray skies, not the freedom he wanted to capture. Sarah appeared in his room every day. She checked the Roman 4, changed the bandages, and sometimes brought magazines that he had not read. Her presence was unobtrusive, but warm, like a ray of sunshine in a cold room. One day, noticing that he hadn't eaten again, she put the tray on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the chair. "You know, if you keep this up, I'll start bringing you pizza," she said with a slight smile. "Hospital food isn't a masterpiece, but at least it keeps you busy." Daniel looked at her, meeting her gaze for the first time in days. "Not hungry," he muttered, but his voice was less harsh than he expected. "It's not about hunger," she replied, crossing her arms. "This is about the fact that you decided to give up. I've seen people like you, and I know that this is not just because of the accident." Her directness took him by surprise. He wanted to snap back, to tell her to mind her own business, but instead he asked, "How do you know?" Sarah shrugged, her smile becoming a little sadder. "Because I was there. My marriage fell apart 2 years ago. He left for someone else, and I was left with a bunch of questions and an empty apartment. It felt like I had lost not only him, but also myself." Sound familiar? Daniel was silent. Her words were like a mirror in which he saw his reflection, tired, broken, but still alive. He nodded, almost involuntarily. It passes, she continued, standing up. Not right away, not easy, but it passes. The main thing is not to let yourself drown. Eat, Daniel. At least soup. She left, leaving him with a tray and thoughts that for the first time in days were not only about the past. He took a spoon and tasted the soup. It tasted bland, but he ate half of it, just to prove to himself that he could do it. Sarah became his little anchor. She did not impose herself, did not try to save him, but her presence light jokes, short conversations pulled him out of the darkness. One evening, as she was checking his blood pressure, he asked, "How did you cope after the divorce?" She thought as she rolled up the blood pressure monitor cuff. "Honestly, I learned to be alone. Not in the sense of loneliness, but in the sense of yourself. I started doing what I loved, but forgot. Drawing, walking in the park, even dancing to stupid music in the kitchen. And at some point, I realized that I am not only someone's wife, I am me." Her words touched something in him. He remembered his camera, his morning runs, and the photograph of a bird at sunset. Maybe he could find himself too, not who he was with Emily, but who he could become. "Are you drawing?" he asked to change the subject. Sarah smiled. "Yes, landscapes mainly. Nothing brilliant, but it's mine. What about you? What do you do besides get into accidents?" He chuckled for the first time in weeks. "Photo. I tried to get back to her recently, but I'm not sure yet what's happening." "Show me sometime," she said, standing up. "Maybe I'm not only a nurse, but also a critic." By the end of the week, Daniel began to get out of bed. I walked along the corridor, leaning on a crutch, and even went out onto the hospital balcony to breathe in fresh air. The depression did not go away, but it became quieter, like a muffled noise outside the window. He thought about Sarah, about her words, about how, despite her experience, she still smiled. It wasn't a romantic feeling too soon, too painful, but her presence reminded him that life goes on. On the seventh day, he was discharged. Sarah helped him pack his things, handed him a list of recommendations, and said, "Don't get lost, Daniel, and eat normally." He nodded, looking at her a little longer than necessary. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." She waved her hand as if it was nothing. "Just take your shots, and don't get hit by trucks again." Daniel returned to the apartment, which now seemed a little less alien. He opened the camera box, took it out, and charged the battery. The sunset was beginning outside the window, and he decided that tomorrow he would go to the park. Not to forget Emily, but to find myself. Daniel stood at the entrance to the city park, holding a camera. The autumn air smelled of fallen leaves and dampness, and the sun, breaking through the bare branches, cast long shadows on the paths. He came here for the first time since leaving the hospital, with the intention of taking a few pictures, nothing special, just to regain a sense of control. But in his pocket was a note that Sarah had slipped him before leaving the hospital. Her phone number and a short, "Call me if you're bored." He wasn't going to call. Didn't want it to look like he was clinging to her. But last night, after another sleepless night, he dialed her number. "Are you seriously calling me at 10 at night to ask if I like coffee?" Her voice on the phone was mocking, but warm. "Yes, I do. Are you planning on giving me a treat?" Maybe he got ready, he replied, surprised at his own courage. "There is a coffee shop in the park. Tomorrow at 2. If you're not afraid that I'll get hit by a truck again." She laughed loudly, without pretense. "Okay, photographer. But if you're late, I'll drink your coffee." Now he was waiting for her, shifting from foot to foot. The cast was removed from his arm, but his ribs still ached, reminding him of the accident. He wasn't sure why he called her. There was no plan, no desire to cross the line of friendship. Just her voice, her lightness, her ability to talk about pain without strain. It was all like a breath of air after months of suffocation. Sarah appeared 10 minutes later, wearing jeans and a dark green coat, with a scarf casually tied around her neck. Her hair was down, and she looked younger than she did in her hospital uniform. She waved to him, coming closer, and her smile was the same as in the ward open, but with a slight shadow of fatigue. Well, did you survive without hospital food? She asked, stopping next to him. Barely, he chuckled, feeling the tension in his shoulders release a little. Come on, I've got coffee on me. They grabbed coffee from a small coffee shop at the entrance to the park block for him, a cinnamon latte for her, and walked along a path strewn with yellow leaves. The conversation started easily, as if they had known each other for years rather than weeks. So, tell me, Sarah took a sip, looking at him over the glass. Are you really a photographer, or is this just a hobby to seem cool? Daniel snorted, shaking his head. Hobby. In college, I photographed for the student newspaper. I thought I would become the next Ansel Adams. Then life took a turn, work, marriage, everything. The camera gathered dust until everything fell apart. She nodded, her gaze becoming more serious. You know, this is cool, that you returned to her. After my divorce, I started drawing, although I hated art classes at school. But it's like finding a piece of yourself that you've lost. And how did you find it? He looked at her, sincerely curious. Sarah shrugged, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her scarf. Sometimes. There are days when I sit down with my brushes and everything goes as it should. And there are days when I just sit and wonder why the hell I'm even trying. But I won't give up. This is already something. He nodded, feeling her words resonate. It's the same with my camera. I shoot, look at the result, and half of it looks like garbage. But the other half, it's like it's saying, hey, you're still here. You can still do it. Exactly, she smiled, nudging him with her elbow. Show me, by the way, or are you one of those people who hides their masterpieces until they are perfect? Daniel rolled his eyes, but pulled out his camera and showed her a few pictures on the screen. A street musician playing a saxophone, a child blowing soap bubbles, a sunset over a river. Sarah watched carefully, tilting her head. Damn, Daniel, this is really cool, she said, lingering over the sunset photo. You have an eye. But this one, with the bubbles, we had to come closer. The moment is lost. He laughed, surprised by her directness. You're a critic, Sarah. Maybe I should hire you. Take it higher, I can also be a model, she winked, but immediately changed her tone. Seriously, continue. It's yours. It's obvious that you live in this. They walked for more than an hour. The conversation flowed from light topics to deeper ones, but without heaviness. Sarah told how after her divorce she moved into a small studio and learned to cook for one, although at first she bought food for two out of habit. Daniel shared how he stopped turning on the hallway light because no one was coming home to greet him. You know what's the crappiest thing? He said as they stopped by a pond where ducks were swimming lazily in the water. I'm still waiting for her to call. Not because I want her back. I just got used to her being part of everything. Idiocy, right? Sarah shook her head, her gaze soft but firm. Not idiocy, it's like a phantom pain. I had the same thing. The first month I checked my phone every 5 minutes. I thought he would write, apologize, say that he was mistaken. And then I realized he won't write. And even if he writes, I don't need it anymore. Daniel looked at her, feeling her words lift some of the weight off his shoulders. How did you get to this point? To the point of not waiting? She thought as she looked at the water. Honestly, I'm just tired of being a shadow of myself. I decided that it was better to be alone, but whole, than with someone who breaks me. And I started small. I bought new curtains, went dancing, learned how to make damn tiramisu. It sounds stupid, but it works. Tiramisu, then? He grinned. Maybe you can teach me. I'm a master of burnt toast. Wow, that's a high bar, she laughed. Okay, it's a deal. But only if you show me how to take your cool photos. Their meetings became regular, but not intrusive. Coffee in the park, walks around the city, sometimes pizza at the diner where Sarah argued with him about how pineapple on pizza was a crime. They didn't call it friendship, but that's exactly how it felt, easy, real, without expectations. They weren't trying to fill each other's emptiness. They weren't looking for romance. They were simply there, sharing the pain that connected them like an invisible thread. One evening, they were sitting on a bench by the river, with a bottle of beer for him and a Coke for her. The sky was dark purple, with rare stars, and the city was buzzing somewhere in the distance. "Do you ever think that things could have been different?" Daniel asked, looking at the reflection of the lights in the water. "Well, if you had done something differently, said something." Sarah sighed, leaning back on the bench. "I used to think. Constantly. Like, if I had been more attentive, sexier, grumbled less, he wouldn't have left. And then I realized, this is not about me. He left because he wanted to. And you're Emily. She also made a choice. Not because you were bad, because that's who she is." He nodded, feeling her words sink into his chest. "I'm still angry. Not at her, but at something I didn't notice, that I let everything fall apart." "Hey," she turned to him, her voice becoming firmer. "You are not a god, Daniel. You can't control everything. And guess what? It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad. The main thing is not to get stuck in it. You are already taking steps. Photos, jogging, even this stupid coffee with me. This is already a victory." He smiled, looking at her. "You are quite a motivator, Sarah. You need to lecture." "No, I'd rather stay as a nurse," she snorted. "But if you want, I can give you a kick when you start whining." "Agreed." He raised the bottle, as if for a toast, and she blinked her glass against it. A couple of weeks later, Sarah invited him over not on a date, but for a tiramisu lesson. Her apartment was small but cozy, colorful pillows on the sofa, paintings on the walls, the smell of vanilla and coffee. While she kneaded the cream and he awkwardly tried not to ruin the biscuits, they chatted about everything and nothing. "Okay, seriously," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you ever think that you would sit like this with some nurse and ruin dessert? After everything that happened?" Daniel laughed at his clumsy attempt at arranging the biscuits. "Honestly, no. A year ago, I thought I'd be with her. Well, Emily, in our house, with our plans, and now I'm here, and it's not so bad." Sarah smiled, her eyes sparkling in the light of the kitchen lamp. "That's what I'm talking about. Life is like this tiramisu. Sometimes things don't go according to the recipe, but if you keep stirring, you end up with something delicious." He looked at her, and at that moment he felt something new, not love, not passion, but gratitude. Because she was there. For understanding his pain without trying to fix it. For reminding him that he was still alive. They didn't become a couple. There were no hints or awkward moments, but their friendship became more than just support. They were like two people who survived a storm and found each other on the shore. Sometimes they were silent, just walking in the park, and this silence was comfortable. Sometimes they argued, like the time Sarah insisted that his photograph of a bridge was too dark, and he responded by calling her landscapes sugar-colored. But every time they parted, they knew that they would meet again. One day, when they were sitting in a cafe, Sarah suddenly said, "You know, I'm glad you called them. I didn't think I needed a friend until you showed up." Daniel looked at her, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in months. "Me too, Sarah. Me too." And at that moment, with coffee in his hands and her smile opposite him, he realized that maybe the pain would never go away. But with her, with this friendship, he could learn to live next to her. Not hiding, not breaking, but simply moving forward, step by step. Daniel woke up to the sound of his alarm clock, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel the usual heaviness in his chest. Outside the window of his small apartment, snow was falling, covering the street with a thin white layer that muffled the noise of the city. It was the morning of December 24th, and the air smelled of something new, not just frost, but possibility. He stood up, stretched, wincing from the slight pain in his ribs that still reminded him of the accident, and went to make coffee. Black, without sugar, just the way he liked it. But there was a jar of caramel syrup on the shelf. Sarah convinced him to try it, and damn, she was right. It didn't taste that bad. He smiled, looking at the coffee maker, and caught himself thinking that this smile was not forced, not for anyone, but just for him. Somewhere in the last few months, between runs, photographs, and conversations with Sarah, life became easier. Not ideal, not without pain, but easier. He no longer woke up thinking about Emily, no longer checked his phone hoping for a message from her. The emptiness that used to fill his days began to recede, giving way to small moments. A snapshot of the morning fog, Sarah laughing at his attempt to cook pasta, the feeling that he could breathe again. Today, he and Sarah were going to meet to spend Christmas together. No plans for a grand holiday, no promises, just two people who felt good being around. She suggested the idea a couple of weeks ago, when they were sitting in a cafe, wrapped in scarves after yet another walk. "You know, I hate these cheesy Christmas parties," she said, stirring her tea. "Everyone pretends they have a perfect life, and then they get drunk and argue about whose turkey is better. Let's keep it simple. You, me, pizza, maybe some stupid movie. What do you say?" Daniel laughed then, feeling her enthusiasm infect him. "Pizza for Christmas. You're definitely not the type to decorate a Christmas tree in November." "Oh, I don't even put up a Christmas tree," she winked. "But if you want, I can find a couple of garlands. Just don't expect me to sing carols." "We agreed," he said, "but I chose the pizza. No pineapples." She rolled her eyes. "You just don't understand art, Daniel." By noon, he left the apartment, grabbing a camera and a bag with a gift for Sarah. Nothing fancy, just a leather-covered sketch pad and a set of pencils that she once mentioned she liked. He picked them out from a small art store, feeling a little awkward but pleased. It was not a gesture of romance, but something simpler, sincere, a sign that he listened to her, that she was important. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked towards the park where they had agreed to meet. The city was filled with pre-holiday bustle. Children were making snowmen, shop windows sparkled with garlands, and Christmas songs could be heard from the cafes. Scenes like this used to make him sad, a reminder of how he and Emily decorated the house, how she insisted on hanging a star on the tree, even though he always grumbled that it was too corny. Now he looked at it all differently. Not with sadness, but with quiet acceptance. That life was over, but this new one was his. Sarah was waiting at the entrance to the park, wearing the same green coat, but with a red hat that made her look like an elf. She was holding 2 glasses of hot chocolate, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. "You're 3 minutes late," she said, handing him the glass. "I was just about to drink your chocolate." "3 minutes is not late, it's style," he replied, taking the drink. "And what kind of hat? Are you officially a Christmas gnome now?" She snorted, adjusting her hat. "This is a gift from my sister. She said that I should look festive at least once a year. And you, Mr. Serious Photographer, where are your reindeer on your sweater?" "I left it at home, next to my sense of humor," he grinned, and they walked along a path strewn with snow. "Thanks for the chocolate. What do I owe you now?" "Yeah, now you owe me for the rest of your life." She poked him with her elbow. "Kidding. I just wanted to start the day right. Let's go. I'll show you a place where ducks are not afraid of people." They wandered around the park, chatting about little things. How Sarah once tried to bake gingerbread and almost burned down the kitchen. How Daniel stole candy from his sister's Christmas, stalking as a child and still felt guilty. The conversation was light, but there was something deeper in it, an understanding that they both knew what it was like to greet the holiday with a hole in your heart, but still find warmth in it. "You know, I used to hate Christmas," Sarah said as they stopped at a frozen pond where a few ducks were still swimming despite the cold. "After the divorce, it was like a reminder that I was alone. All these films about family, love, and other nonsense. It was infuriating. Now, well, not that I'm a fan, but I like it, especially with pizza and bad jokes." Daniel looked at her, feeling her words resonate with him. "It's the same for me. Last year was a nightmare. Emily and I were already on edge, but we pretended that everything was fine. Christmas tree, gifts, everything according to the script. And this year—" He paused, searching for words. "This year is the first time I'm not pretending. And it's strange, but good." Sarah nodded, her gaze soft but without pity. "This is progress, Daniel. when you don't play a role, but just live, even if it means eating pizza instead of turkey. He laughed, shaking his head. You are quite a philosopher, Sarah. Maybe I should write you a book. How to Survive Christmas with Pizza and Ducks. Oh, I already see a bestseller, she winked. But only if you make the cover. Your photos are something. In the evening, they returned to Sarah's apartment, which was decorated modestly but comfortably. A small garland on the window, a couple of candles on the table, a blanket thrown on the sofa. Sarah ordered pizza margherita for her, pepperoni for him, and they settled on the couch, turning on Home Alone. The movie was so familiar that they spent more time talking than watching. No, seriously, Sarah poked him with a piece of pizza. How can you believe that Kevin coped with 2 robbers? He's 8 years old. At 8, I was afraid of the dark. Well, he's a genius, Daniel shrugged, taking a sip of his beer. What, were you a coward? I don't believe it. You're like a superhero now, saving people, painting landscapes, making tiramisu. She snorted, leaning back on the couch. Oh yes, just Wonder Woman. In fact, I'm still afraid of spiders. If I see one in the bathroom, it's the end of the world. I'll remember, he chuckled. If I see a spider, I'll call you with the newspaper. Just try, she poked him in the shoulder. What are you afraid of? Except for trucks, of course. He thought, looking at the screen where Kevin was building traps. I used to be afraid that I would be alone. At all. Without family, without someone who knows me. And now, I don't know. Maybe I'm not afraid anymore. Or I'm just tired of being afraid. Sarah looked at him, her smile growing quieter. This is also progress. When you stop being afraid of loneliness, it stops being so scary. It just becomes part of you. He nodded, feeling her words sink in somewhere deep. You're right. And guess what? This Christmas is the first time I don't feel lost. Thank you. She waved her hand, but her cheeks turned slightly pink. Hey, don't get sentimental. Otherwise, I'll make you sing Jingle Bells. Only over my dead body, he laughed, and they clinked glasses of beer and cola. Before midnight, they exchanged gifts. Sarah handed him a small box, inside of which was a leather camera strap with the initials DW engraved on it. So you don't drop your precious camera, she said, but her tone was soft. And to remember that you have a fan of your photographs. Daniel smiled, feeling warmth in his chest. Sarah, this is cool. Thank you. He handed her his gift, and her eyes lit up as she opened her notebook and pencils. Damn, Daniel, were you spying on me? She laughed, leafing through the notebook. This is exactly what I wanted. You're officially the best. Well, I had to pay back for the chocolate, he winked. They sat for another hour, chatting about plans for the next year. Sarah wanted to take a vacation and go to the ocean to paint waves. Daniel was thinking about having a small exhibition of his photographs, not for the sake of fame, but just to put an end to this stage. They didn't make plans together, didn't make promises, but there was something in their conversation that made the future less scary. When he turned to leave, Sarah walked him to the door. Snow was still falling, covering her porch with a white carpet. She hugged him briefly, in a friendly way, but with warmth that he felt for a long time. Have a nice Christmas, Daniel, she said, looking at him. And don't disappear, okay? We still have a lot of pizza ahead. Have a nice Christmas, Sarah, he replied, smiling. And no pineapples. She laughed, closing the door, and he went home, under the snow, feeling that life, despite everything, had become easier. Not because the pain went away, but because he learned to bear it with a camera in his hands, with a friendship that required nothing but sincerity, and with the warmth that he found on this quiet Christmas evening. Daniel pushed his cart around the supermarket parking lot, maneuvering between cars. The basket contained modest purchases: coffee, bread, a couple of apples, frozen pizza, nothing extra, just enough for one person. The January sun, pale and cold, reflected from the snow, blinding my eyes. He squinted, straightening his scarf, and thought that he should stop by the park after lunch and catch the sunset for a new photo. Life, which until recently seemed broken into pieces, began to form into a new mosaic not ideal, but its own. He stopped at his car, opening the trunk, when he heard a voice behind him. "Daniel?" The voice was familiar, but did not immediately come to mind. Daniel turned around, and his gaze met Mark's. He stood a few steps away, in a dark coat, with a package in his hand. His face, usually confident, now looked uncertain, almost awkward. The hair was slightly gray at the temples, and the eyes, which Daniel had once hated, seemed tired. Daniel froze, feeling as if time had stopped for a second. He waited for the storm to rise within him, the anger that had been simmering for months, the pain that this man had ruined his marriage. But nothing came. Only silence, calm, almost frightening. He looked at Mark and did not feel hatred. "I felt nothing but a slight surprise, as if I had met an old acquaintance whose name you barely remember." "Mark," he said, and his voice was even, without a trace of emotion. He turned to the trunk, putting away the bags as if the conversation had already ended. Mark stepped closer, his boots crunching on the snow. "I didn't expect to see you here. How are you?" Daniel closed the trunk, taking his time, and looked at him. The question sounded as if they were just colleagues who met once a year at a corporate event. He could have laughed at the absurdity, but instead he shrugged. "Fine." Mark nodded, his fingers gripping the handle of the bag nervously. "Listen, He hesitated, looking somewhere to the side. "I know everything was difficult, and I wanted to say that I'm sorry. I didn't want it to happen like that." Daniel looked at him and images flashed through his mind. Emily laughing in a bar in Chicago, her hand on Mark's shoulder, their kiss that tore his life apart. He expected these memories to bring back the pain, but they were like old photographs, clear, but no longer alive. Mark stood in front of him, trying to apologize, but his words sounded empty, like an echo in an abandoned house. "You don't need to apologize," Daniel said, his voice calm, almost soft. "It doesn't matter anymore." Mark blinked, clearly not expecting such an answer. "I just thought, maybe we should talk. Should I clarify everything?" Daniel shook his head, his hand resting on the handle of the cart. "We have nothing to talk about, Mark. Everything became clear a long time ago." He saw Mark open his mouth to say something else, but he didn't give him a chance. He turned, pushed the cart to the counter, and walked towards the car. His steps were even, his breathing calm. He didn't look back, didn't quicken his pace, didn't allow himself to think even for a second about what Mark had said. It wasn't victory, it wasn't forgiveness, it was just a lack of need for them. Once in the car, Daniel turned on the engine and looked in the rearview mirror. Mark was still standing in the parking lot, looking after him, but after a second he disappeared from sight. Daniel pulled out onto the road, and the snow fell softly onto the windshield, dissolving under the wipers. He turned on the radio, and an old Bob Dylan song filled the cabin. For the first time in a long time, he sang along, quietly, almost unconsciously. At home, he unpacked his groceries, made coffee, and sat down at his laptop to review the pictures he had taken last week. One of them, the silhouette of a tree against the sunset sky, seemed successful to him. He smiled, feeling something inside him finally let go. Mark, Emily, their marriage were all part of his past, but not his present. The present was here, in this apartment, in his cell, in conversations with Sarah, in the snow outside the window. And this present, no matter how simple it was, belonged only to him. The evening was cool, with a light wind that carried the smell of spring earth and the first flowers. Daniel and Sarah were sitting on a wooden bench by the river, the same one where they had often walked in recent months. The city behind them hummed with its usual rhythm: cars, voices, the distant ringing of a tram. But here, by the water, everything seemed quieter, as if the world had given them a break. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and orange, and the river reflected the sunset, turning it into flowing gold. They sat close, their shoulders almost touching. Sarah had a glass of cold coffee in her hands, and Daniel had a camera, which he had brought to catch the light of the sunset. But now he wasn't filming. He simply looked forward, feeling the warmth of her palm in his. their fingers intertwined almost imperceptibly, without words, as if it was natural. It wasn't a romantic gesture, at least not in the movie sense. It was something deeper, a connection between two people who went through similar pain and found support in each other. The last few months have changed Daniel. He no longer woke up feeling like his life was a ruin. His apartment became a home. Photographs of him hung on the walls. Books stood on the shelf that he read in the evenings, and in the refrigerator there was always a jar of caramel syrup, which Sarah brought, laughing at his grumbling. He ran in the mornings, worked at a company, and organized small exhibitions of his photographs in local cafes. His life was not ideal, but it was his honest, real, without pretense. Sarah was part of this life. Their friendship, which began with coffee in the park, grew into something more, although they never put a label on it. They were in no hurry, did not make plans, did not make promises that could be broken. But their conversations about the past, about dreams, about silly little things like the taste of pizza or the best place to take sunset photos became the foundation on which Daniel began to rebuild himself. She didn't try to fix him, didn't fill the void Emily left. She was just there, and that was enough. Today, sitting by the river, he felt ready to take a step forward, not because he was afraid of loneliness, but because he wanted to share with her not only pain, but also joy. He turned to her, and she looked at him, her green eyes sparkling in the sunset light. "You know, I was thinking," he began, and his voice was slightly hoarse, as if the words were stuck in his throat. "You and I have been through everything. And I don't want this to be just friendship. I want it to be bigger." Sarah raised her eyebrows, but her lips twitched into a slight smile. "Wow, Daniel, are you proposing to me? We didn't even kiss." He laughed, feeling the tension release. "Not really. Well, maybe yes. Listen, I'm serious. You are the best thing that happened to me this year, and I want to be with you. Not just walking and drinking coffee, but being together, if that's what you want too." She was silent, looking at him, and for a second he thought he had made a mistake, that she would say no. But then her smile widened and she squeezed his hand a little tighter. "You know that I'm not one of those who rush into the deep end," she said, but her tone was warm. "But yes, I want it too. I like you, Daniel, not just as a friend. Just, let's take our time, okay? Let everything take its course." He nodded, feeling relief mixed with something new, a hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. "In my own way, I can do it." But then his face became more serious, and he looked her straight in the eyes. "Just one thing, Sarah. If ever, if you decide that you don't need me or find someone else, tell me. Don't lie. Don't do that thing." He paused, not wanting to say Emily's name. "If you cheat on me, I won't forgive you, and I will do everything to make you feel as much pain as it was for me." Sarah didn't look away, but her smile disappeared. She nodded, and in her eyes there was not resentment, but understanding. "I'm not her, Daniel, and I'm not going to betray you. But I hear you, and I promise, if something goes wrong, you will be the first to know. Honestly." He exhaled, feeling the weight he was carrying with him become a little lighter. "Fine. Thank you." She leaned closer and, unexpectedly for him, kissed him on the cheek. "Now stop scaring me, photographer. Let's watch the sunset instead." They sat for a long time, holding hands, until the sky darkened and the stars began to appear over the city. The conversation flowed into the usual lightness. Sarah teased him for the fact that he still had not learned how to cook tiramisu, and in response he promised to arrange a photo shoot of her super artistic landscapes. But between their jokes there was something new, not loud, not bright, but quiet, like the warm light of a candle. Daniel looked at the river, at the reflection of the city, at its profile, illuminated by the last rays. And at that moment he realized that his life did not end with Emily's departure, with the accident, with the divorce. She just started anew, not like he expected, not like in his old dreams, but real. There was pain, scars, mistakes, but there were also moments that made life worth living. That sunset, that hand in his, that laugh that he wanted to hear again and again. He didn't know what awaited him and Sarah. Maybe they will be together for years, or maybe their paths will diverge. But now, this evening, he was sure of one thing. He was ready to move forward, without looking back, without clinging to the past, but accepting what is and what can be. "Let's go," he said, standing up and holding out his hand to her. "I want to take a picture of you against the background of this sky. Don't tell me you're not photogenic." Sarah laughed as she stood up. "Okay, but only if you make me coffee later, with syrup." "Agreed," he replied, and they walked along the river. Their steps sounded in unison, and the future, for the first time in a long time, seemed not frightening, but full of light. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.